Hi, everyone. I'm John Hock. I am a volunteer with the Portland Psychedelic Society. This is the first of a 5-part series on Indigenous knowledge and the psychedelic renaissance being presented by Ronan Peck. Ronan has been a volunteer with the Portland Psychedelic Society since about 2019. They are the author of an excellent microdosing presentation that all of you can access on our meetup site and certainly at the microdosing event that we have once a month. Ronan has just graduated from PSU with a degree in psychology, eventually hopes to get her doctorate in clinical psychology. This is an expansion on her undergraduate thesis. So Ronan, thank you very much. Really glad to have you here.
Okay, so let's first start with talking about the psychedelic renaissance and also why it's important that we learn about the ancient history of entheogens. Psychedelics are currently gaining popularity again in the public eye after a decades-long fight against them, a fight which started in the late 1960s with Nixon's war on drugs, a fight which unfortunately continues to proliferate to this day. However, despite this government-sanctioned battle, there are many individuals and groups who are fighting back, people who have a deep understanding of what psychedelics can bring humanity. One group in particular holds a very important role in the fight to bring psychedelics out of illegality, specifically because the government is much more likely to listen to what this group has to say than any other organizations or communities. I am, of course, talking about psychedelic scientists. Scientists have solid ground to stand on when it comes to advocating for psychedelics due to the way that science is heavily regulated and standardized. This regulation starts and ends on a governmental level. Therefore, the government knows they're able to trust what science has to say about something. In a lot of ways, this is completely fine and really good. Actually, we need psychedelic science to confirm that what we as psychonauts experience is indeed valid and safe. And furthermore, science has the ability to tell us how and why psychedelics work. These are all very important things, and it's amazing that we have people working tirelessly to once and for all prove to those in power that psychedelics have their place in society. This modern day advocacy for psychedelics is what is known as the psychedelic renaissance. But what about the individuals and groups who have known about psychedelic healing for thousands of years, even before the invention of the scientific method? What about the lived experiences and firsthand generational knowledge of indigenous groups who have been participating in entheogenic practices since at least 1000 BCE and perhaps even earlier? This is my thesis to highlight that the knowledge of indigenous groups who are systematically oppressed across the board continues to be ignored and discounted for other types of knowledge that the government considers more valid. Consider that science is just one way to view the world. It's a very valid form of understanding, yes, but it is not the only way to understand. Furthermore, science is a very Western-based view of the world, one that is ultimately tied to colonialism. The government, still rooted in colonialism, has a bias towards Western understandings of the world and a bias against BIPOC experience. This means that indigenous knowledge is continuously being undercut and undermined in lieu of what the government considers valid. Furthermore, BIPOC are not receiving benefits from the science of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. However, this point will be talked about way more in depth in my section on war on drugs and structural racism in a couple of months. So definitely come check it out. In my eyes, this is exactly what we as individuals who directly benefit from the discoveries of psychedelic science should come to know and understand. That indigenous use of entheogens predates what most of us think about when we think about great psychedelic innovation and discoveries. It is important to know, understand, and advocate for this essential indigenous knowledge, both for the benefit of indigenous communities, which is very important, but also for the benefit of a deeper and more whole understanding of psychedelics. So what are entheogens? I've mentioned them a few times, but what are they exactly? Entheogens can be described as any psychoactive drug that is consumed or imbibed for the express purpose of religious or spiritual practice. In this case, we will be focusing on psychedelics, but other drugs such as the Amina muscaria mushroom of Siberia, which is classified as a delirium, kava tea, commonly imbibed in the Pacific Islands, and tobacco used as an entheogen by Native American populations are all considered entheogens despite not being psychedelic. So the following is a list of the most common psychedelic entheogens and in which regions they are most commonly used. So we have ayahuasca in the Amazon basin in South America. We have various psychedelic cacti, all kind of found within South America. Cannabis from India and the Middle East, iboga from the Congo and Gabon, Psilocybin from Mexico, Peyote from Mexico and the southern reaches of North America, which used to be Mexico but is now the southwestern state, and salvia, again from Mexico. Each of the substances I've listed here are very important to their practitioners, of course, but for the sake of time, I shall be primarily focusing on psilocybin, peyote, and ayahuasca. So let's start with mushrooms. Psilocybin-containing fungi are perhaps the most common and well-known hallucinogenic plants, and there are certainly reasons for this. To start, these mushrooms grow in every single continent except for Antarctica. They're incredibly widespread and normal to find growing just about anywhere mushrooms grow, the most common areas being wetter, more tropical locations. And this is according to a review of the worldwide distribution of psychoactive mushrooms conducted in 2000 by Gaston Guzman, which recorded not only the number of distinct species of hallucinogenic mushrooms, but also cataloged where they grow. There are over 200 species of Bastidiomycota mushrooms that contain psilocybin, the largest genera out of 11 being psilocybe with over 116 species. The bulk of these grow in Mexico, with 53 separate species being found there, but are also located in the Northern Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia, and the surrounding islands. This means that people all over the world have had access to hallucinogenic mushrooms, psilocybin containing or otherwise, such as in the case of the Amida muscaria mushroom, which was an important entheogen of the indigenous people of Siberia. Psilocybin-containing mushrooms have seemingly been a large part of human culture as far back as 5000 BCE, evidenced by mushroom-inspired cave paintings in the Tassili Plateau of northern Algeria. Even more concrete evidence shows up in Central and South America with the Mayan mushroom stones of Guatemala, dated back to 1000 BCE. There is good indication that these stones were indeed religious objects. So both the Mixtec and Aztec indigenous groups of Mesoamerica worshipped gods related to psychoactive plants, mushrooms, of course, being a big part of what was worshipped. For the people of the Mixtec culture, the name of this god is, and please forgive me for my awful pronunciation, Pitzontalculti, translated most simply to seven flower. For the Aztec, their god is named Zacapili, or Prince of Flowers. And this god is the divine patron of the flowery dream, which is their name for the ritual hallucinatory trance state that's brought on by the mushroom. Furthermore, the Aztec even had a word for a specific species of psilocybin-containing mushroom that they named Tinonacatl, otherwise known as God's flesh. So a large part as to why we have this historical anthropological evidence to this day is unfortunately tied in with colonialism, but it kind of gives us a good idea of what these ceremonies looked like to outsiders. So as reported by a Spanish priest by the name of Bernardino de Hasagun in his Florentine Codex, the first thing to be eaten at the fest were small black mushrooms that they called nanacatl and brought on drunkenness, hallucinations, and even lechery. They ate these before the dawn with honey, and when they began to feel the effects, they began to dance. Some sang and others wept. When the drunkenness of the mushrooms had passed, they spoke with one another of the visions they had seen. Seems pretty cool to me, but the Spanish invaders had other ideas. We all know this next part, unfortunately, the Aztec civilization and its downfall at the hand of Spanish colonizers starting in the early 1500s. The invaders, guided by the strictures of Catholicism, aimed to strike down anything that they considered satanic or pagan. And regrettably, this included the ritual use of any non-alcohol intoxicant. The amazingly rich and religious consumption of these mushrooms was nearly wiped out entirely by colonialism, although ironically, it is due to their interference that we have anthropological evidence of these ritual practices. Peyote is the name of the cactus that contains the psychoactive protoalkaloid known as mescaline. And for the curious, a protoalkaloid is a type of alkaloid, which is a naturally occurring organic compound produced by living organisms, including plants, bacteria, fungi, and animals, originating from amino acids. Most protoalkaloids are psychoactive in nature, but mescaline is also found in the San Pedro cacti, as well as a few other less well-known cacti that all grow in the same region. These cacti and the resulting extracted compounds have been used for at least 5,700 years by the Native American populations in pre-colonized Mexico, part of which is now known as southwestern United States. This data was gathered through carbon dating mescaline buttons that were found with other significant cultural materials. So one of the first historical documentations of the use of mescaline was, again, recorded by Spanish colonizers around the late 1600s to the early 1700s. And as we learned from psilocybin, these colonizers were doing their best to suppress the use of any kind of ritual hallucinogen. The spiritual use of peyote and other mescaline-containing cacti was documented during the 17th century with a number of Native American tribes, including, but certainly not limited to, the Kiddish tribe of New Mexico, the Hopi, Isleta, and Tau tribes of the greater southwestern states, and the Caddo tribe of the Southern Plains area. This way of life continued to be uprooted during the 1800s as tribes were forced away from their homelands into new unaccommodating conditions, a place where mescaline-containing cacti did not grow. Through this restriction came a retaliation. However, peyote was slowly being reintroduced into their lives via horseback trading, and peyote rituals went from previously practiced rituals to the creation of an entire church based around the cactus. It is unclear exactly which tribe established the NAC, which stands for the Native American Church, but the church's main goal was to protect and strengthen the Native American right to perform peyote rituals, as well as preserve the rich history and the importance of this cultural practice. So the NAC serves as a way to band together tribes and individuals under symbology and meaning, but beyond that, peyote rituals serve to provide a needs-based solution to psychological problems Native Americans were encountering in the newly enforced reservation systems. In this case, the consciousness expanding power of mescaline would help NAC members to heal physical, mental, and spiritual imbalances within themselves and among their social relations, helping to assuage the effects of the needs-denying arrangements of the reservation system. The point here is that despite any attempts to quell or suppress the use of psychedelics, those who are able to harness its power for healing will fight for the right to do so, regardless of how difficult that fight may be. Moving on to ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, otherwise known as the vine of the soul in the Quechua language, is a brew made by the indigenous peoples who reside in the Amazon basin. The primary psychoactive compound contained within the brew is N,N-dimethyltryptamine, more commonly known as DMT, which is extracted from the Psychotria verteris shrub or other DMT-containing plants through a process of boiling. This preparation is more than simply DMT, however. What sets ayahuasca apart from other DMT preparations is the inclusion of the Banisteriopsis caapi vine. This vine, when boiled, releases a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, a type of psychoactive compound that is quite well known in the United States and around the world for its antidepressant effects. These specific alkaloids contained within the vine are known as harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine. These alkaloids prevent deamination of DMT in the gut when combined, meaning that the DMT does not break down as easily, and this leads to more exposure with stronger and longer lasting effects. There is physical evidence of the use of ayahuasca dating back to 1,000 years ago. This evidence was extracted and carbon dated from what was deemed a ritual bundle, a fox snout pouch carefully stitched together, implying the importance of ayahuasca as an entheogen to the indigenous folks who partook. Aside from physical evidence, we also have anthropological evidence, again, stemming from Spanish and Portuguese colonizers who unfortunately demonized and attempted to fully eradicate ayahuasca rituals from indigenous South America. We can start to notice a theme here. Indigenous cultures discover and have a significant use for these entheogens, which they utilize for thousands of years until the Western world attempts to abolish anything they consider to be satanic in the name of Christian or Catholic theology. So ayahuasca rituals are endemic to the Amazon basin area in South America, with a large number of tribes imbibing it for entheogenic purposes and beyond. Entheogenic rituals involving ayahuasca traditionally involve a shaman, which is actually a Western catch-all term for specialists who conduct various ceremonies, who is helping guide those under the influence of the powerful brew. These rituals are typically described by Westerners as being aimed at helping one face and overcome past traumas in order to heal from and move forwards with life. The word of the seemingly magical brew has spread all around the world, which means that people from all over want to try their hand at fixing their ills through this healing concoction. This has resulted in a few different phenomena. First is what is known as drug tourism. As we know, ayahuasca contains DMT, which is illegal in the States and most parts of the world. This means that people, usually from Western countries, are flocking to the Amazon to get their own experience with the drug that they've heard so much about. There is some inherent personal risks that one takes when conducting drug tourism, but the most concerning thing to me is the colonization of entheogenic ceremonies such as those with ayahuasca. This is the second phenomenon that has occurred thanks to the popularity of ayahuasca ceremonies. So let's listen to what Mark Hay has to say in his November 2020 article written for JSTOR Daily. The widespread belief in the power of authentic traditional rituals and the shamans who lead them is problematic at best, outright dangerous at worst. For starters, there's no true or authentic ayahuasca ritual or even set of rituals. But more importantly, says Ruben Orellana, a Peruvian archaeologist in Quirindaro, which is a type of shaman, ayahuasca traditions were developed for people coming from specific cultural backgrounds. As such, even though the brew itself and some of the ritual practices surrounding it may have similar raw effects on anyone, they will likely generate very different overall experiences different risks and benefits for outsiders and insiders. At best, this means that many Westerners may be shelling out large sums for experiences they are not well situated to fully understand or benefit from. In the process, they contribute to the wanton commodification and fetishization of the cultures whose practices they wish to insinuate themselves into or to co-opt. At worst, it means that some individuals may expose themselves through their misreadings of context and content to serious physical or mental dangers. So essentially, these plants and the groups who have consumed them traditionally have grown together and are inextricably linked to one another over thousands of years of human and plant evolution. This is not something that a tourist and outsider would ever be able to replicate for themselves. These rituals carry meaning that someone from a Western hemisphere would not necessarily even be able to pick up on, simply because their frame of reference is completely different than indigenous groups in the area. Furthermore, many ayahuasca lodges, even in the Amazon basin, are being run by outsiders, making it impossible for traditional communities to even benefit financially from the drug tourism. This is even more insulting when you know that for thousands of years now, these indigenous communities have had to deal with militia and missionaries demonizing the use of ayahuasca by burning their sacred plants down and criminalizing these ceremonies as much as possible. So in conclusion, it's great that the psychedelic renaissance is in full swing, and it's great that we have psychedelic scientists working hard in the background to make our dreams of a legalized country a reality. But throughout history, we have left behind arguably one of the most important groups who use and advocate for psychedelic healing, that being indigenous communities. It is of the utmost importance that we do our due diligence to educate ourselves on this rich history. Don't stop here. Let the short introduction inspire you to continue to dive deeper and reach further. It's the least we can do.
Well, we're going to open it up for questions at this point. Todd asked, what was the name of the article from 2020 by Hay?
Oh, it's called The Colonization of the Ayahuasca Experience.
Hey, Ronan, I got a question. Great presentation. And I'm curious if in your research, kind of exploring these different ancient cultures and their use of psychedelics, if you did a lot of digging into the ancient Greeks and their use of psychedelics and kind of how that has influenced kind of the early days of religion.
I did not dive into that, but that is fascinating. Okay.
One thing, there's a lot of research being done that if you were, I'm going to use Christianity as an example, if you read the entire New Testament in ancient Greek, you would not once see a reference to alcohol, because the concept of fermenting grapes did not exist back in those times. So wine to the ancient Greek would have meant something completely different in the way that we think of it. And there are certain words that have roots that mean like to mesh or to combine. And there's also been a lot of writings done of like many different recipes of things that they would spike wine with, including things like salvia and even mandrake. There's a lot of research being done that wine in like ancient biblical times could have been a psychedelic drink, which really changes the history of the origin of a lot of religions then, if that is the case. So yeah, just something interesting. I didn't know if you had dived into that much.
I hadn't, but thank you for bringing that to my attention, because that is fascinating to me. Thank you. I'm like going to have to add that on to my research.
Hi there, and thank you for the presentation. It was great, and I appreciated your concern of the tourism, the drug tourism, of it being another way of colonizing their area, and maybe disrespectful is even an understatement, but maybe that's too strong for some people. I don't know if I'm accurate on this, but it's my understanding that peyote is an endangered species of plant in the United States. From what I've heard of indigenous people requesting that it just be used by them. And I wonder if that's something that you've found as well in your research or personal life?
Yeah, I mean, that is like a huge concern within indigenous communities, and without is these sacred plants kind of being capitalized on, and then being, maybe not peyote, but I know that white sage is like a huge thing where it's almost extinct because of the amount of people who go out, harvest it, don't know actually how to harvest it, end up killing the plant instead of continually cultivating it, and then they go and sell it in their little Etsy shop or something. It's not a great situation. I know that that's definitely happening, and I would not be surprised if that is also happening with peyote.
Rowie asks, hi, Rowan. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Have you come across any North American indigenous nations that were especially known for their psychedelic use? Does their motivation have any parallels with today's motivations for using such substances, or is it totally something different? I joined the presentation at the 8-minute mark, so sorry if you covered it already. Actually, you haven't, so.
So yeah, I mean, like there are kind of like the tribes that I mentioned when I was talking about peyote that were kind of like this big like Mesoamerican, like Mexican, Southwestern states tribes. They're now considered North American tribes, but the Quidditch tribe, the Hopi tribe, the Isleta, the Pau, and the Caddo tribe were all tribes that I mentioned that are like they have traditionally used peyote and continue to. And these are certainly like not the only tribes. It was just the ones that were kind of mentioned the most during my research. But does their motivation have any parallels with today's motivations? And just speaking from my own personal experience as just like a white person, I have a feeling that it's pretty different. I have a feeling that like what these substances mean to these groups is kind of entirely different than what psychedelics mean to like most of the Western world. When the Western world thinks about psychedelics, we think about like scientific greats. We think about Timothy Leary. We think about like people who like researched at Harvard, you know, like we don't think about this deeply intertwined, intrinsic use of entheogens that's very much related to culture, rather than just kind of different individualistic, trippy experiences, even though they can be very profound and important.
I was just kind of going to comment, kind of going back to the drug tourism, but modernizing it and Americanizing it, if you will, regarding just kind of spiritual guides that have kind of taken over the cultural aspects that happen with items such as ayahuasca or peyote. And just kind of from my previous experience, I've recalled talking to some people that it's just, they go to these group gatherings and they pay $50 a person or $500 a person, and just kind of, it just keeps adding to the drug tourism that exists here in North America. And instead of us going out as a tourist, now we're having our own shamans. And I wanted to hear people's thoughts on that.
So yeah, anybody can talk on this, but I'll just kind of share what I learned throughout my research. It's still kind of not really like an equivocal experience to say that you're going to do an ayahuasca ceremony in the United States with a traditional ayahuasca shaman, because ayahuasca rituals, they're not really, it's not like this one thing that every single group, indigenous group in the Amazon basin all came together and this is what an ayahuasca ceremony is. We've kind of conflated a lot of things, particularly in that article that I mentioned in my presentation, the Mark Hay one. He kind of talks a lot about the different, almost kind of like cultural cues, the way that Westerners versus indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin, their frames of reference, how they consider things. You can kind of have the same basis of a trip, but take completely different things out of it because you're not thinking about hallucinations, visions as a spirit animal guiding you. You're thinking about it in terms of the individual and like the ego, the I. That's kind of like where a lot of Western practitioners are kind of based out of. Whereas for them, it's kind of more of this thing that has very slowly developed over thousands of years that is very much tied into their culture. Yeah. I hope that was cohesive enough.
So what I hear you saying, I think it's inevitable, okay, the appropriation, not appropriation. It's inevitable for Westerners to seek this, to seek these substances and seek to use them for whatever purposes have. Right? I mean, but when does it become cultural appropriation? And that's, I think, where people aren't sensitive. They just feel like they're in a shopping mall, you know, and they'll just pick it up and do it. And it's really offensive. But I don't think they realize what they're doing. We need to talk about it with people just to raise the awareness, I think. Don't know what else to do. You know?
I guess there's a lot of directions and avenues to go down, of course, in this topic, because there's a lot of different things happening. I had an old coworker whose brother guided ceremonies in a Brooklyn building, which just sounds nightmarish, I will say. And then I've had an ex-partner who went to a ceremony with this shaman who seemed, like, forgive my terminology, but like very legit, and traveled with this group of folks and artists and musicians and everything that would do all of these ceremonies with him. And so I'm thinking, what about those folks who are legit and like choose to bring their culture's medicine and healing practices to Westerners for, $400, Yeah, I guess I generally wanted to hear thoughts too. And what about, like, where's the sourcing coming from when these ceremonies take place, within the US? Who's allowing it, or who's, defacing the forest or stealing or something like that. But I think what's in the forefront of my mind as far as like a concise question, sorry everyone, thanks for listening to me ramble, is what would you, Ronan, or anyone else have to say about this shaman who was apparently, like chosen by his tribe and stuff? I think from Peru, I don't remember where this guy came from, and chooses to host ceremony for Westerners. Or maybe there's just different opinions around, I guess, with any group of people, there's individuals within them. So,
well, I think that's kind of like one of the main points with discussions of cultural appropriation. It should the deciding factors should come from the people who are a part of the culture that is being appropriated. There's going to be individual differences all within that group. We're all still figuring it out. Appreciating a culture is definitely very different than appropriating a culture. And, if there's a shaman from the South American basin who is like, you know what, I'm going to go to America, I'm going to go share this beautiful practice, and at the same time, raise money for myself and maybe my community. More power to you.
Hi. Yeah. My name's Leo Sunshine, and I'm a radical fairy, and I've been involved with the Northwest Radical Fairies for almost 30 years, 27 years. And we believe in creating our own rituals, and they're pretty simple and heartfelt and appreciative of other cultures that we all draw from. And I think it's really important that we look at this history of all these indigenous people and this indigenous use, realized that we have centuries of suppression and oppression around it, and realize that during this Renaissance, it's up to us to create the rituals that we as a people need now for ourselves in our immediate communities, and stop thinking that these traumatized indigenous communities that are barely surviving are going to save us. There's medicine from them, and we can learn from them. But I really think that it's up to us as Westerners, as people with all this privilege from all cultures and all backgrounds and all histories who are living here together, to figure out what we need to do now here with this medicine in these times. And I feel so blessed to be here in Portland during this time and to have access to community building exercises like this, because between the legalized therapeutic use that's coming and the decriminalization, which has been incredibly liberating, the fact that I think more people are just comfortable coming together and talking like this. So it's like, okay, we're not going to go to jail now for talking about what rituals we need to create to survive now, right? And there's no elder in our community that's going to pick us out and choose us to be the shaman or to be the priestess or to be the minister. We have to step up and decide, I am the minister for those around me, and I'm going to find what medicines help us the best, and how can we stitch together and weave a community and weave a fabric of healing, because the best of times are now and the worst of times are now, and all we have is here is now. And I'm really appreciative for this community, and Mushroom Magic has been doing incredible things for me, and I've been weaving little tiny circles here within my corner and creating tiny little new rituals for my people, and I encourage us all to do the same. So thank you for hearing me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really couldn't agree more. It is absolutely not up to Indigenous communities to kind of, you know, be the messiahs and like save us. But it is up to us to kind of be like, oh crap, like we gotta fix that and like make reparations, you know, until we're all at the same level. But yeah, I really love the idea of like creating our own rituals that serve us now, because we need that.
There's a lot being said. I want to go with others and, you know, give a thumbs up to what Leo had to share. I think that's a really important point. Kind of just the two things I would sort of add kind of around that. A lot of times in psychedelic community, we talk about respecting Indigenous peoples within the context of psychedelic work, which is important. But I think it's also important to remember it's important outside of that context as well. Like, it's not something specific to psychedelic work, just in the world in general, we need to respect and honor Indigenous communities. And I think the psychedelic aspect is part of that rather than the other way around. So yeah, no, I just think it's important to, like, you know, because I often forget that. So just reiterating that context. And another thing I was thinking, a way to think about, like, earlier, the topic of cultural appropriation came up, and it's always really tricky. But I think part of that is that it's a very Western Enlightenment thing to want to say, like, this is what's cultural appropriation and this is what's not. Like, there's a line and it's bright and it's definable and there's a good side of it and a bad side of it. And that's probably not how it works, but this is the way our Western minds want to think about things, you know? So I don't have an answer to that, but just to, like, to point out, to be aware that, like, a lot of the problem around cultural appropriation might just be the way we're thinking about it, you know? And we might never actually, like, figure it out as long as we're thinking about it that way. So, okay. I just want to toss those into the pot. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. These are all really important things to think about and consider and talk about, you know, because otherwise, how are we going to figure it out? It's like a discursive process. And yeah, there is a lot of like white performativeness, especially, you know, in this region of the world. Why are we the ones to be able to say what is correct or what is not when it's not even our own culture?
I've been involved for probably a decade pretty seriously with just seed saving. And several of my mentors are Indigenous. One of the mentors with the seed school, we've conversed for years, and she's very open in the sweetest of ways of letting people that are not Indigenous to this land feel welcome, accepted, appreciated despite colonization, that we find what we lost. They feel like, they being Indigenous here, so many who came, especially from the European countries, were for so many generations tied up in war that we don't even really have any memory that we know how to find. Maybe we can find them with these psychedelics to find out what we lost. You know, the paganism, how many people were burned at stakes, the colonialism that you talk about, Ronan, that we've done to these Indigenous Americas literally was done to ourselves in Europe. And a lot of the reasons that we ended up here is our ancestors survived to get us away from it and stay alive. What I find with Indigenous friends, including locally here in town, helping rematriate things like with seeds, I do a Hidatsa shield bean to get it back to the Dakotas. Help them and be open to guidances they have, but not having the expectation that they fix us. And so I agree, we need to fix ourselves. I think it's really important to have guided journeys. It's why I haven't done any in decades, because there can be some very painful stuff in there that I think is important to be comprehended and guided through. And so, like David was bringing up the Romans, and what we hear as wine may have been completely different. So I think it's also our research and as a community helping each other through these. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. I think there was a lot of good stuff there. Yeah, I mean, everyone all across the world, we all have like immense generational trauma that needs to be, you know, addressed. and psychedelic guided journeys are a very, very good way to do that. And I didn't mean to imply during my presentation that Indigenous folks are the only people who do this, participate in this. It's good to know and like be aware that as this psychedelic renaissance is kind of occurring, that there are groups all around the world that have kind of been doing this for a really long time. This is not a new thing. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say about that.
I am not speaking for PPS at this point. I'm speaking for myself. I just wanted to 2 points following on what Lori and Leo and others have said. Holly, 2 things. One is about sourcing and one is about discovering what ritual is good for you. And I can only say for that, dig into follow your own blood. Go back, research it. If you go back far enough, you will find shamans in the mix. You will find Indigenous people from where your DNA is sourced from. And very often you'll find a matriarchal society, but you're going back a long time. But there's enough out there to learn. And from that, you can actually recreate your own rituals. It's all of what neo-paganism is all about right now. A lot of the stuff was lost during the Reformation and other times, the Christian aberration, as I like to call it. You can find that and you can create it. And it is very, very rewarding. And along with that, we come to sourcing. We're talking about peyote being on the endangered species list. So is the buffoutine frog. I've got that wrong, but the frog that you get 5-MeO-DMT from is being decimated because of people going out harvesting these frogs and then letting them loose, thinking that they're going to live, but they can't. They're often cut off from. They will do everything they can to get back to where they were born, which is where they're going to live and die. And unfortunately, many of them can't get back there. It's a horrible exploitation of the animals for drug appetites in the north. If you really want, I haven't done this yet. My intention is to grow my own mushrooms. And I can't think of a better way of getting more in touch with your personal entheogen than to actually grow it yourself. Just as food, you grow yourself. There's something really, really life affirming when you eat that food that you have grown yourself. The same is true, I'm sure, and many have told me this, that yes, growing your own mushrooms is an excellent way to get in touch with your own entheogen. Same with cannabis. Some of you may be chemically adept and can create your own LSD, but that's not me or many people I know. But I'm done. Thank you.
That's a very good point. Growing your own mushrooms to be more connected to them. I love that.
I'd like to say one more thing, if I may. I think there's so much to learn by looking back as far as we can go, but I also think there's so much to learn from just looking at our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and thinking about the dramatic, traumatic, earth-shattering things they survived, from the Spanish flu to the world wars to the oppression of capitalism that had children in minds and stuff. We don't have to go back far to find powerful people that survived terrible things and that had created, every generation create their own ministry. I mean, the evolution of Christianity or any religion over however long is about each generation changing it. Culture changes religion more than religion changes culture. And we need to figure out how we want to minister to each other in 2021 and beyond, and using these medicines. Last night, I had my first ever heart-centered magic medicine and dosing discussion circle. And there were 9 of us, 2 from Canada, 2 from Seattle, and 4 or 5 from here in Portland. And we used Radical Fairy Heart Circle technology of just casting a circle, speaking from the heart, listening from the heart, confidentiality, yada, yada, yada. And we talked about the medicines we use, everything from chocolate to antidepressants to sex to microdosing to megadosing. And we went around and just shared on that. And then we had a pee break. And then we came back and we had dosing discussions. You know, and I think that what's missing in this pharmacologia of our lives right now, where we're dosing with so many things, from caffeine to cannabis to whatever. I developed cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. I was sick for 5 days of vomiting or more 4 times last year from using cannabis. My concern is if people start using these new medicines in the psychedelic renaissance in compulsive addictive ways, which we all know we like to do, what's going to come of that? And so we're at this really revolutionary time where we have to have these small group discussions like we're having now, and like I had last night, about how we as a community support each other. I have friends who are homeless on the street with methamphetamine addictions right now. I'd love to see them get some psychedelic therapy, but they also need housing. How do we create these little things that weave us together, and how do we use these new medicines in responsible ways? Because they will be co-opted, they will be appropriated, and they will be medicalized and clinicized. And it's up to us to create a grassroots parallel path, not to try and stop that one. That one is a steamroller. It's gonna happen anyway, right? My friends in Canada are like, oh yeah, you can already buy mushrooms in all the stores and dispensaries here in Canada. I'm like, okay, whoa, and I'm here in Oregon and things are shifting. So I just really think we need to create the community technology, which in the past has been called religion, to minister to one another with these medicines. So thank you.
Leo, I just love every single thing that you have to say. Thank you. I'm like over here just like mind blown. Cheers. How do people keep safe? And like, how do people keep sane? And like, not just, when you're 15, you take acid at a party and it could be a great time, or you could be like scarred for the rest of your life. Creating these communities that like actually talk about this stuff, and a whole rhetoric that reaches not only within our communities, but outwards, I think that will absolutely be paramount. Because yeah, it is kind of scary to think about, okay, if people have more access to things, there's much more of a risk of things going wrong. Because yeah, you can be psychologically dependent on any of these substances, and that's a really good thing to be aware of.
My mind just shifted a lot with all of your shares. I felt a little bit foolish for what I said at first, but now I'm glad that I said it because I learned so much. So thank you, everyone. I was looking at the events list on the meetup is how I found this group, and I saw one about intuition. And I think that's a huge missing factor because, yeah, Leo, what you were saying about like dosage and getting sick off of cannabis, and I recently just kind of surrendered to stopping trying to force myself to fit the mold of, what cannabis is touted as, a one size fits all kind of thing. It seems it just blew up on the scene with the legalization and everything. And it's like, when you use these things, or like alcohol, and like in AA, when they call folks who can have a beer and walk away, and they call them like normies, like it's this idea of like, what's wrong with me that this isn't working? And then that could lead you to like, those sort of thoughts like self and like loathing and stuff that just leads to more destructive and it's just bringing up this feeling of like tense, rushing, external seeking, grasping what works with that person, and then it doesn't work for me, and then like loading it on, and then this like idea of more, and like so many of these concepts and feelings and mindsets are part of our culture in the US, but community speaks. I was thinking, my closest cultural roots are Italian, and I was thinking about, my grandparents and everything, and how did they cope? And I was like, well, it's not in, it wasn't in the best ways. Like, I can't find anything that sounds healthy or desirable in the ways they coped, but like maybe not in the amounts that they use, but like food. And then with food comes like community and patience and getting in touch with your, your senses and those sorts of like pleasurable moments. And and then I don't really want to touch alcohol, but like, and wine and stuff. But I was thinking about, the communal aspect and how community, and then like this lack of intuition that we have, and this lack of this schism between wanting more and more and more, and maybe it's going to work if I add, but really with, our lack of community, we're left with ourselves, and we're left with only our own judgments of ourselves and our own judgments of what we're doing right or wrong, and why is it not working for me, and our own judgments of other people's experiences. Like, we don't know what they're actually doing because, weed's cool and stuff or whatever, and like, or it's chic, or there's an aesthetic, but like, we don't actually know how it's actually serving someone. And so, yeah, so community is a huge part of it, because like, even if you're still sort of not super in touch with yourself, you're not really in tune to what's serving you, having community to discuss these things with, be open and vulnerable and bounce these things off with. Those are all the thoughts that came up. I hope there was some wealth in sharing them, and thank you for the space.
Thank you for being here and sharing. We appreciate it.
Both Leo and Erica, you said things that I wanted to kind of, run with. Leo, you gestured, I think, to something really important when you're talking about like homeless folks and their struggles with addiction, and that there is a tendency, not saying that we're doing it here, but we've all seen it, to like talk about addiction as like a property of the substance and disregard the social context, which just does not work. I mean, I just want to keep in mind, like, so much of addiction, for example, is social context. And it's not about like chemical properties of a substance. Some of it is. I'm not saying that's not there, but the emphasis is usually on the substance rather than the social context, it seems. And then this, I think, talks directly to what Erica and you were saying about community, like it really sort of all comes down to that. Like, no amount of plant medicine is going to really help someone who doesn't have food, who doesn't have a home, who doesn't have community. Those are problems that exist. Plant medicine might like kind of reveal their nature to us, but it alone is not going to solve these social problems, and those are still going to be there to be tackled.
It's difficult doing this stuff and like being an advocate for something that is still heavily illegal all across the board. There's a lot of moving parts, and it gets complicated. So it's good to be like, this is what we're trying to do. Tim, you got a question?
There's been a lot of talk this evening about Indigenous cultures and their history and our own history in this culture. Looking towards the future, are we searching for a future that's different than the past as humanity, regardless of Indigenous culture, Western culture, but global culture? The species. And there's a reality, of course, to everything that's been said tonight, for sure. It's part of the story. But I wonder also about the story of us as a species, in which all of the different threads of humanity from, 50,000 years ago have been weaving through the millennia to this moment that includes our thread, this what we call the Western thread, the white thread. It's just part of a process, perhaps, of a species that's trying to evolve, a species that has developed tools that are threatening, and that has resulted in, however you understand that narrative, from 300,000 years ago, approximately, when this kind of being began, has got us to this moment. The medicines, as we're calling them, the plants, have been here also, and we've been engaging with them in our various ways. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about our attention to a process into the future that we're thinking about. How do we as a species, how do we as a group, including all of us, our different colors and our different, et cetera, find a way into the future that will allow for survival, at least, and maybe some flourishing, along with all the other living beings on this little precious planet that we find ourselves on. And it's only now that we can think about the planet in the way that we do. It's only now that we've seen the planet from space, so to speak, that critical photograph. And it's only now that we're beginning to recognize the possibilities, although we've had myths for a long time, Prometheus and Pandora, Midas, Icarus in the Western tradition, but in other traditions also stories that have told us about the dangers of our psyches, as well as the potentials for our psyches. But now we're faced with it. We're coming up against questions of diversity and how do we live together in peace that we've never really done. I mean, I know there's talk of some cultures that have been more peaceful. I don't know how accurate they are, but as a generalization, the species is a little challenged. As you said, with power comes responsibility, and this species has a lot of power, and we haven't quite got our responsibility up. We don't know how to do that, and we've never really known how to do that. So all this is to say, as well as the focus on the history and everything that we've talked about, a thought to this thing we're trying to make for the future, this thing we're trying to find together, and that can be part of this, of what we're about together.
So thinking about equity and thinking about like cultural equity and thinking about how does each individual kind of contribute to whether or not we like accept other cultures, because like as it is right now, like we're kind of, America's like every man for himself, just try your best, pull yourself up by your bootstrap. There's not a whole lot of equity. I think there could be a lot more equity with, you know, just being able to foster empathy in people starting from a young age. And I really see like a lot of like good in the psychedelic community for that specifically. I feel like the psychedelic experience really engenders a lot of empathy for yourself and other people, because it kind of opens your eyes to like, we are all one. It opens your eyes to like the true like human experience, regardless of culture or experiences or anything, you know. Kind of unfortunately as a whole, we're not really there yet.
And it's both and, you know, there are the struggles and the divisions that you're referring to, and somehow we're all part of the story, and we gotta somehow lift ourselves up by our bootstraps together if we can. And that's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Or just, yeah, exactly. Like having that empathy and like realizing that as you're pulling yourself up, you can pull up the person next to you, etc. Just everybody gets pulled up together.
I just wanted to bring in, there's a guy named Stephen Jenkinson who works out of Canada. I got into his work because he did a lot around palliative care, but he's also a storyteller and has done some apprenticeship and training with Indigenous communities in Canada, although he's a white guy. And he talks about something called orphan wisdom and sort of brings forward the idea that for people who are disconnected from our sort of Indigenous ancestors, that we have a reality that looks something like being orphaned. So it's not that we don't have parents, but we don't know them. If we think about ourselves as sort of relatives to other people, this is related, I think, to getting to some of what Tim is talking about, then the place that we occupy is that we're sort of like these orphans who showed up on our family's doorstep and acted really terribly often. We're sort of acting out in a way, and that our responsibility in some way, this is now I'm moving away from what Stephen Jenkinson had to say and into my own interpretation, but that our responsibility then is figuring out what does it mean to repair those relationships. We're growing up, we're learning, we're understanding that the way we acted out as children, we aren't able to do anymore, and we need to have different relationship that comes back and says, thank you, and I'm ready to learn and to bring that sort of respect. So I don't know, but Stephen Jenkinson's got some pretty great ideas.
Yeah, white is not a culture. Like whiteness is not a culture, you know, like we all come from our own like various separate backgrounds, but we have been, you know, pretty much completely cut off from that. So yeah, like viewing that in the frame of reference as being kind of cultural orphans, I think that could be like really powerful. As it is right now, like the psychological, psychiatric realm is very white dominant. And I'm going to be talking about this later in later presentations, but like it's really not reaching BIPOC communities. I think literally only like 2% of participants in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy trials are Black, only 2%. It's astronomically low, while like white, it's like 89%, like something like that. So that's kind of like the main point. Everybody should be included. Science is really important. Indigenous knowledge is really important. And we need to be aware that like it's not reaching the people that it kind of desperately needs to reach.